In this video, I'm going to walk you through the installation procedure for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator Kit on the 2017 and newer KTM 390 Duke. To quickly review some of the details of the Vagabond Motorsports kit for the 390 Duke, this is for the 2017 and newer Duke, so it's the second gen. This will not work on the first gen 390 Duke. You can tell this is a single piece of CNC laser cut and CNC bent aluminum coated in UV resistant satin black powder coat. Should match the kind of factory texture very well. It's got folded in flanges that pick up two of the mounting holes, so it's ultra stiff. And then one of the other things that's also very unique about this is that we fold up these side flanges and this little closeout flange so that this really does fill up the rather large hole that is opened up when you take the factory fender off. That's something we'll give you a little bit closer look on in a second. Some of the other things that we include in this kit are going to be a zip tie mount, so that the wiring coming in to the tail section is going to be very kind of well controlled. We gave you an extra grommet going into the tail section to protect the tail section from kind of road spray, protect the wires from getting chafed. And then the last extra thing that comes pre-installed on the Fender Eliminator are going to be these two license plate bumpers that just minimize license plate buzzing, and on the case of singles like the 390, license plate cracking. We are setting this Fender Eliminator up to use either the factory turn signals, which use both of these holes on the side flanges, or OEM aftermarket turn signals that use that 10mm stud that's very common in the industry. We do reuse the OEM license plate light. It's a nice LED unit. It'll keep you kind of DOT certified, things like that. Last thing that is probably worth mentioning in the kit is we include a full set of corrosion resistant hardware. So 4 stainless steel button head screws, 4 stainless steel lock washers, and then 4 machined aluminum spacers that are going to allow this to securely bolt to the metal part of your subframe as opposed to just squeezing the plastic portion of the rear subframe. As for tools we need for the installation, start with the 10mm socket and ratchet, 4mm Allen key, 14mm open end wrench, Phillips screwdriver, some flush cutters, dikes, really anything to cut a zip tie. We do recommend you have some kind of either masking tape or some other kind of tape. We'll get into why you need that. It's just our recommendation. If you've got a power driver and some bits to speed things up, go ahead and use those. We're going to begin the installation process by removing your factory rear fender. That starts by popping your passenger seat with the key in the left side or shifter side. You can release the prong and lift it from the rear forward. We're going to undo the wiring next. There's going to be 2 zip ties that we're going to cut. And the kit's going to give you 2 new ones, so you don't have to worry about wire management getting kind of sloppy. There's going to be a big one on this huge bundle, and then there's going to be a small zip tie. Kind of pull some of this aside. That's actually holding the loom going down into the factory fender. So that's that small zip tie running around your tail light as well as your fender light. And we're going to hook both those back up with new zip ties. So once you're there, we're going to disconnect these 3 gray, red, and green connectors, and they are going to be, you kind of push on the forward side of the motorcycle connector, and you should be able to pull them apart. Once you've got those 3 done, we can go to the underside of the bike and actually just unbolt it from the subframe. To pull the factory fender is going to be 4 10mm hex head bolts that we just need to remove. As you take your last bolt out, obviously the fender is going to try to fall down. Just be mindful of that and support it with one hand while you loosen it with the other. Fender's going to kind of fold backwards, release it, and from the top side, all you have to do is just push one connector out, electrical connector out at a time so they don't get caught. Set that factory fender aside and we'll break it down. And one of the things you notice when you actually remove the factory rear fender on the 390 Dukes is there's actually a fairly large and complicated hole left in the undertail of the motorcycle. And so one of the benefits of the Vagabond kit is that it really does have all these kind of folded flanges on it to really seal up and conform to that shape, so that when you do put the fender eliminator up against that hole, you can kind of see along the edges right up to the little notch on the tail light, and then down where it actually connects back to, call it this plastic under tray, we kind of conform to that surface. So that's something that's kind of unique to the Vagabond Motorsports kit here. Once the factory fender's off the bike, I'm going to start by taking off the license plate. Every dealer's probably going to do this ever so slightly differently. On this bike it's just Phillips head screws and 10mm lock nuts. This hardware is going to get reused, so set everything aside. Once you've got your plate off, go ahead and flip the fender upside down. There's going to be 2 more Phillips head screws here that we need to remove. At this point, you kind of feel that plastic shell wants to separate from the metal spar, and that's okay. You just have to be careful you're going to guide out these 3 connectors through this rectangular spar tube. At the end there's kind of a rubber plug. You can kind of pop that off for now. We're not going to reuse it, but it does help to get all the cabling out. So pull everything out of the steel backbone. At this point, pull that rectangular grommet off. I like to put everything back together when I'm taking off a factory fender just for storage. So go ahead and pop that guy back on before you set it aside. Once you've got the plastic portion by itself, all we're going to do is take the turn signals and the license plate light out of the factory fender. Turn signals are going to be a 14mm open end. Make sure you kind of grasp the support plastic as evenly as possible here, just so you don't end up breaking anything. We're going to reuse all this hardware. It's going to give you a nut, a serrated lock nut, and a washer, and that's going to go in that order. So we can pull the other turn signal off. They are labeled fairly clearly on the 390 Duke, but for reference, the right hand side is going to be the gray connector, and the left hand side is going to be the green connector. Turn signals out, and then it's just 2 Phillips screws for the license plate light. We are going to reuse those screws, so set your light aside with the 2 screws. At that point, you can put your factory fender back together for storage, and we'll move on to the fender eliminator. Now, a common question we get is how much weight does a fender eliminator save? And in the case of the 390 Duke, it's actually not insignificant. In the factory fender, so once we strip all the lights out of it, we're about 2.7 pounds, and the fender eliminator ready to accept all the lights is a little bit more than 0.7 pounds. So you're saving right about 2 pounds by swapping all your factory lights on over to the Vagabond fender eliminator. Once you've gotten all the lights out of your factory fender with the hardware that we discussed, so for your turn signals you're going to take the washers, the serrated washers, and the flange nuts, and for the license plate light you're going to take the 2 kind of thread cutting screws in the plastic. Next, we're going to assemble all these lights back into the fender eliminator. This is how the fender eliminator is going to come to you. with both the grommet and the zip tie mount pre-installed. So at this point you're just ready to start with lights. My suggestion is going to be start with the license plate light. So you thread the connector through the central hole, and then the two factory Phillips head screws in the two like the right and left holes. I'd caution against using a power driver here just because it is easy to maybe get carried away with the tightening torque and strip the plastic out, because that's all it actually is tightening into. But just run the two screws in with a Phillips screwdriver. You'll definitely feel them get tight. You want to make sure that the light is not at an angle, because there's a little bit of bolt clearance there. So if it is, you can just loosen it a little bit and straighten it out by eye, and then tighten those two screws. Once you've got the license plate light on, move to the turn signals. And this is looking from the rear of the motorcycle, so you can grab your turn signals. They are still labeled. This is the right side. You'll notice the turn signal has a little peg, plastic peg that's going to key into the round hole, the small round hole in the fender eliminator, so that you don't have to worry about what direction, or sorry, what clocking angle you have on your turn signals. It's just going to be right by assembly, which is a nice little feature. Once you've got it in threaded through the fender eliminator, start with the round washer or flat washer, then serrated, and then castle nut or flange nut. Spin it around for you. So it's going to be important that when you start to get close to tight, that you are keyed in with that little plastic boss, that little stub. Otherwise you can crush it if you tighten it without actually being keyed in. Then grab your 14mm wrench and give it a nice snug tightness. Move on to the left signal. Same exact process. We'll thread through the washers and run them down. Key in that little boss. And it helps to hold on to the boot or the base of the turn signal while you're tightening, just so you don't actually try to like shear off that little plastic tab. Now, what you should notice is that when you go kind of look at it from a distance, that your turn signals are clocked the same way or tilted the same way. And just because there's a little bit of adjustment there. Once you get to this point, there's really only wiring left to do before we move on to essentially bolt prep. And you'll see we give you one zip tie mount here, and we'll run a zip tie through that in a second. But what I would start with is feeding the 3 connectors through the pre-installed grommet, and then we'll get onto the zip tie next. So there's enough space that you can get all your connectors through. Just kind of, obviously the more wiring loom you have through it, that grommet slightly more tight it's going to get, but you do have enough room if you kind of push them one by one through to get them through the grommet. So take one of the supplied zip ties at this point, and there's going to be a little slot in those mounts, or that zip tie mount. Slide it through the mount, start a loop, and you don't need to get everything like crazy tight here, so give yourself a little bit of a service loop just so that your wires aren't under tension forever. So I like to push it kind of back towards the lights, then snug your zip tie up, tighten that up, then take a set of your flush cutters and trim that zip tie. At that point now, that wiring is going to be super secure. Now we're ready to prep the bolts for install onto the fender eliminator. Now before we put the fender eliminator on the motorcycle, I highly recommend that you do a little bit of essentially preparation on the hardware. And all that really entails is you take the fasteners that we include in the kit, put one of the lock washers under the head of each of the bolts, and then insert them into the holes in the fender eliminator. Now because we run these machined aluminum spacers to give you the appropriate setback from the subframe, so everything's perfectly kind of set up, it's kind of hard to keep track of these guys while you got 4 bolts, 2 hands. It's a little bit of a mess. So I would recommend, doesn't have to be blue masking tape, but some kind of tape, preferably something that doesn't leave a bunch of residue, easy to remove, and just run the tape across half the head, so you're not covering up the hex key opening. Realistically, all this is doing is kind of holding them from falling out. It's not super scientific. If you want to kind of try to hold all 4 bolts up at the same time, be my guest, but this is a stupid simple step that makes a huge difference. And just kind of make sure the tape is at least kind of stuck to the fastener head. It's not critical here. All you're looking for is that you can get your 4mm Allen key into those 4 bolt heads, but at the same time you can flip this thing upside down now, and your bolts don't fall out. So like I said, this is just a recommended step, make your life easier. At this point, the bolts are going to be kind of pointed all crooked. That's totally fine. Slide those 4 aluminum spacers down on top of the bolts, and then you kind of have the ability to hold this with one hand, guide wires for the other, and then one by one step through and get your bolts seated, and then the tape comes off in 2 seconds. So that's a recommended step for install. Now for the installation onto the motorcycle, start by feeding one by one, again, the electrical connectors up through that oval grommet in the tail section of the motorcycle. At some point you're going to want to get your other hand on the top side and kind of pull yourself close. And then with your 4mm Allen key, you're going to start, kind of pick one fastener. These bolts are provided pretty long so that you can kind of eyeball your way into the alignment. And the nice thing about the tape is it's going to kind of break free pretty quickly, such that once you kind of get a couple threads in, you'll know, okay, that's good, the tape's no longer doing anything. And just kind of step your way around, get all 4 bolts in, at least a couple threads. The nice thing is you can kind of peek in with these long bolts. So, for example, let's see, now that I've got, you can take the tape off, and now it should kind of float, kind of jiggle around a little bit. And at that point, realistically, what I would recommend is, because it's going to be a little bit of a snug fit, is to figure out how you want it to sit. On the case of, you see, you may have to kind of just barely nudge up your tail light like that. But once you then hold it up with one hand and spin in the 4 bolts, and once you get one nice and tight, you don't have to hold it up anymore. But what you'll feel is that you will bottom out against that aluminum spacer, and it's not going to be like, oh, I'm not sure how tight to make these. It's going to get really tight, really firm. You're going to bottom out that lock washer, and it's going to be clear that it's kind of like as tight as it needs to go. So that's the nice thing about running those spacers, that you're not like preloading up against a plastic part or anything like that. So tighten her up yourself, all 4, and then we're going to move to the top side and just reconnect wiring. But you should already be pretty snug on the wiring down below with that zip tie, but it's always good to kind of just double check that you're pulling up on the top side. So in order to button up the wiring, you'll see we've got a lot more wiring loom coming out because we've shortened up obviously the runs from the factory fender to the fender eliminator. But it's going to be super simple, just gray to gray, green to green, red to red. And then you'll take the second zip tie that we supply, and you'll see you already have this big mess of cable. We're not going to run that zip tie back here just because this one already is fairly secure. So you're going to kind of take your existing loop, or existing where that originally that big zip tie was, and kind of pack in your longer turn signal and license plate light looms. So just kind of do it in little loops, like almost like a figure eight, and then take that second zip tie that we give you and squeeze it down. Don't go super tight on this one. Again, grab your flush cutters and snip that end off. At that point, you'll have more or less exactly the same scenario you had on the factory setup. Last bit there is going to be to put your passenger seat back on. This one has 390s, have the front hooks. You kind of slide the whole, oops, set it forward, and that's it. Now once you get the wiring taken care of and the passenger seat back on, reinstall your license plate with the factory hardware or the OEM hardware, and do a quick system check. Make sure your tail light, brake light, license plate, and turn signals are all still functional. I'm going to give you a couple extra walk around views of the installed fender eliminator to give you a feel of the kind of clearances to the body lines and kind of overall fit and finish. Our products can be found direct on our website, www.vagabondmotorsports.com. Also available on Amazon for Prime members and eBay. Thanks a lot.